once we start to like map out a sentence, you could think of it sort of like these mobiles that you sometimes see hanging up in art museums or over a baby's crib. You have like these groupings, these two elements are hanging from this, you know, all 5 of these elements are hanging from here, these 4 are hanging from here, these 3 are hanging from here, these 2 are hanging from here. This is sort of what words in a sentence are like. They're not linearly ordered, they're ordered in these hierarchical ways where they're balancing off a single point. So the train chugged along the line through the mountains. The train is the subject. The train, that's kind of hanging from a single element. Chugged along the line through the mountains. Along the line through the mountains. So this would all be one element. We could work from the bottom. Mountains, the mountains is one thing. Through the mountains. So the mountains would be a noun phrase. Through the mountains would be a prepositional phrase. The line through the mountains, that whole thing would be a noun phrase. Along the line through the mountains, that whole thing would be a prepositional phrase. Chugged along the line through the mountains, that whole thing would be a verb phrase. So you could see this way. This would be the whole sentence. This would be a noun phrase here, the subject. This would be the verb phrase with the verb. This would be a prepositional phrase. This would be the noun phrase, the line through the mountains. This would be a prepositional phrase, through the mountains. The mountains would be a noun phrase. So these phrases get stacked inside of each other and they get grouped up. And basically that's what's going on in this kind of a diagram where you see these things put together, is that they're trying to show what are the order of groupings, what combines first and then gets inserted by which other thing. The mountains modifies through the mountains modifies line, the modifies line, kind of builds up. These sorts of diagrams are what we would call a syntax tree. They're called a tree because they sort of look like the roots of a tree, or if you flipped them upside down, it would look like the branches of a tree. And we can actually show that different groupings would result in different meanings. So here I have the policeman shot the man with the rifle. And here I have the policeman shot the man with a rifle. And we actually have 2 different meanings. In one meaning, in this one, the man has the rifle. The man with the rifle is all hanging from a single point. That's all a single noun phrase. And then the policeman shot him. In this reading, the policeman shot the man. And how did they shoot the man? They shot the man with a rifle. So with a rifle is hanging out over here. It's not an integral part of the man. In this case, it's actually the policeman used the rifle in order to shoot the man. So there's actually different groupings here, the same linear order, but there has to be different groupings. And this is proof that we need a hierarchical model of syntax, not a linear ordering, because this is the exact same linear order, but yet there's 2 different interpretations. There's 2 possible meanings. So there has to be some sort of grouping. It's the grouping. It's who is with a rifle grouped with that matters and that describes this. So the different possible hierarchical relationships explains the 2 different meanings. Another example would be a simple conjunction noun phrase, like is old men and women, old men plus some women of whom oldness is not described, because here old is just describing the men, it's not describing the women. Or is it old somebody, old men and women, where here the oldness would transfer over to both the men and to the women. In this kind of an order, oldness would only be ascribed to the men. The women don't have any oldness ascribed to them. So the fact that it's ambiguous in the phrase old men and women, who is old? Is it just the men, or is it both the men and the women? I need there to be 2 possible different hierarchical orderings to explain the fact that I can get 2 different meanings out of this sentence or out of this phrase. So constituency and hierarchy. Constituents are these groups of words that act as a distinct syntactic unit. We've been talking about phrases so far. A sentence, though, basically is in some ways a constituent in and of itself. It's the topmost or the highest level. So as the rain fell, cats ran under the porch. This whole thing is a sentence. This whole thing would be a constituent. It's all kind of hanging from one point up at the top of that mobile, that top of that tree with everything hanging down. Sentences themselves can be divided into clauses. And each of these clauses could be a sentence on its own. The rain fell is a sentence. Cats ran under the porch is a sentence. But then I can take these 2 little mini sentences, which are called clauses, and I can combine them with this word as and a comma to make as the rain fell, cats ran under the porch into a higher sentence. So sentence is the topmost level here. Clauses are sort of within a sentence. Within clauses, then we can have phrases. So as the rain fell, the rain would be a noun phrase. Fell would be a verb phrase that consists of just a verb. The rain fell could be sort of the independent clause. As the rain fell would be a dependent clause. Cats run under the porch. The porch would be a phrase. It's a noun phrase. Under the porch would be a phrase. It's a prepositional phrase. Ran under the porch would be a phrase. It's a verb phrase. Cats ran under the porch. This whole thing would be a clause, independent clause within the sentence. And then that whole thing gets embedded within the larger sentence. As the rain fell, cats ran under the porch. So I have these sort of like phrase level groupings here. The porch, under the porch, ran under the porch, the rain. And then each one of these words would itself be a head. So in terms of the syntax, the sentence is made up of many different heads. As is a kind of a complementizer here. It's a sort of, you could think of it as a subordinating conjunction, might be the word that you've heard for that before. The is a determiner, rain is a noun, fell is a verb, cats is a noun, ran is a verb, under is a preposition, the is a determiner, porch is a noun. So these are all heads. And so the determiner and the noun get combined to make a noun phrase. The preposition plus the combination of that noun phrase comes together to make a prepositional phrase. The verb plus that prepositional phrase comes together to make a verb phrase. The noun cats plus that verb phrase comes together to make a clause. Cats ran under the porch. So you can see constituency is basically which members belong together, what's inside these sort of parentheses. Then hierarchy is this notion of stacking, that these phrases are within another phrase, which are within a clause, which might be within a sentence. Again, sort of like those Russian matryoshki dolls. So there's two different tests for whether or not a string of words is a constituent, whether or not these things would be a phrase or would be a clause or would be a sentence. We can use movement tests and we can use substitution tests. If a string of words, like a linear grouping of words, can all move together as a unit, it's a constituent. So something like I like the dogs. The dogs would be a noun phrase, like the dogs would be a verb phrase, and then I like the dogs would be the sentence. I can take the dogs and move it out to the front. The dogs are what I like. So the dogs can get moved out here together. The dogs are what I like, and leave the like behind. That's a sign if they move together that they're a constituent. But I can't just move dogs and leave the behind. I can't say dogs are what I like the. The dogs has to be moved out front together. I can move like the dogs out. Like the dogs is a verb phrase. Like the dogs is what I did. Or like the dogs is something I never expected I would do. So that whole thing can move together to be the sort of focused element. But I can't say like is what I did the dogs. I can't move like out and leave the dogs behind. It's because like the dogs itself is a constituent. So in order to move like, I would have to bring the dogs with it. So playing around with the order and these sort of movement tests is a way to test, is this a phrase or not? Or am I just moving out part of a phrase? Am I taking out the head but stranding the modifiers? Another test would be if a string can be substituted with something else. If a complex string of words could be substituted with a single word, it's a constituent. So again, we have I like the dogs, I like them. So the pronoun them can replace this phrase, the dogs. I like the dogs, I like them. The fact that I can replace both of these elements with a single pronoun is a sign that these are a phrase. These act as a phrase together. I can't say I like the them. I can't just replace dogs with the pronoun because I'm replacing something that's meant to be a whole phrase. Here I'm just replacing the head, but I'm leaving the modifier of that head stranded. No, this has to replace an entire phrase at a time. I do. I can replace like the dogs with I do. I like the dogs. You like the dogs? I do. And do is kind of a pro-verb phrase, the way that them is a pronoun phrase, a pronoun. It stands for the entire verb phrase like the dogs. What do I like? What here replaces the dogs. So I can ask this question, what do I like? So I can take the noun phrase out of this, what do I like, and leave that behind because it's a complete constituent. I'm not abandoning the rest of it behind. So we could apply these tests to this data. The news upset the entire family. I can move it. The news is what upset the entire family. I can substitute it. It upset the entire family. So this is proof that the news is a single phrase. In this case, it's a noun phrase made up of a determiner and a noun. We ate our lunch near the riverbank. I can move it. Near the riverbank is where we ate our lunch. I can replace it with a single word. We ate our lunch there. So it passes the movement and substitution test. So I know that near the riverbank is a single constituent. In this case, it's all a prepositional phrase. The head is near. That's the preposition. Then there's this noun phrase, the riverbank, the head of which is riverbank, and the is telling me which riverbank. So near the riverbank. But in this one, the computer was very expensive. I cannot do computer was the expensive. That doesn't work. There's nothing I can do that I could move these three elements together. And there's nothing that I could put in here that would replace these three elements, these three words. This is a sign that this is not a constituent. The boundary isn't here. The boundary is in fact here. The computer is one element, was very expensive as another. This is a false grouping. I love peanut butter and bacon sandwiches. I could say I love those sandwiches and replace that. So that's a sign that peanut butter and bacon is acting sort of as a constituent here. I can't really easily say peanut butter and bacon is what I love sandwiches, but I can say peanut butter and bacon is the kind of sandwiches I love, and I can move that all out to the front together. The environmental movement is gaining momentum. This doesn't work. I can't say movement is gaining momentum is the environmental, or movement is gaining momentum, the is the environmental. Like, there's nothing I can do to move these four words together, and there's no single word I could place in here that would replace all four of those. The environmental, there's nothing I can do. So this fails the movement and substitution test. This is proof that movement is gaining momentum is not a phrase. The environmental movement is one phrase, is gaining momentum is another phrase, but there's no phrase which would include just these four words.